this month's Avian Community of Practice webinar. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's presentation. As a couple of quick reminders, World Migratory Bird Day 2022 is coming up in May. The theme for this year is going to be focusing on light pollution. So you're going to have lots of opportunities to engage with both Biological Resources Division, of which I am a part of, and also the Natural Sounds Night Skies Division, as we will kind of co-sponsor this, or help to co-sponsor this World Migratory Bird Day. Next month, we have Dr. Harry Jones with the Institute of Bird Populations, and he will be talking on the Southern Colorado Plateau Network bird monitoring, past trends, and proposed future protocols. As a reminder, if you have questions, I will keep everybody muted during the presentation. And if you have questions, you can either put them into the question box and I will read them, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you. If you are self-muted and type it in, I probably will unmute you as well, just in case there's follow-up questions or it makes for good back and forth. Today's presentation, From Monitoring to Management, Developing Actionable Science in Grasslands to Support Biological Diversity and Human Values, is presented by Brant Ryder and Chris Latimer. Brant is the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies Chief Conservation Scientist. He's broadly trained in avian ecology and population biology. Before joining BCR, he completed his PhD at the University of Missouri, followed by over a decade of working as a research scientist at the Smithsonian. Chris is the research director at BCR. He has a background in landscape ecology and applied conservation. Before joining the BCR, he completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, followed by 5 years as a postdoctoral research associate working at the Nature Conservancy. And without further ado, Chris and Brant, the presentation is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
All right, thanks Dave for the introduction, and thanks everyone in the audience for tuning in for the next hour or so while Brant and I talk about some of the amazing work that we're doing at Bird Conservancy, leveraging some of our long-term monitoring data to develop some analysis and decision support tools that will help guide more informed management decisions on the ground, and hopefully so that we can make better choices or achieve better outcomes for biodiversity and human livelihoods. Before we get started, I'd like to first acknowledge all of the individuals and hard work that went into making this presentation a success. There were a lot of hands involved in this effort, and whether that's from data collection to data analysis and interpretation of results, to meeting with individual landowners and translating those results into conservation actions. A lot of people engaged in this work, and I get the pleasure of sharing their hard work with you all today. The slides are not advancing. All right, there we go. So I'm sure it comes as no surprise to all of us that our grasslands provide a whole host of ecosystem services that not only support biodiversity, but human health and well-being as well. So from range productivity that supports cattle production, to nutrient cycling, carbon capture and storage, erosion control and runoff, to supplying ample opportunities for recreation, from hunting and fishing to wildlife viewing and of course conservation. Our grasslands do a lot to a lot of work to support us and keep us healthy and whole. As a whole, grasslands cover roughly 40% of Earth's terrestrial surface, and are under extreme threat due to ongoing habitat loss and degradation, which compromises their ability to supply those key ecosystem functions that many of us, hundreds of millions of us, in fact, rely on every year. And so in North America, two of the greatest threats that face our grasslands are habitat loss and fragmentation due to agricultural expansion and woody plant encroachment. And so these two factors alone have contributed to roughly 85% of the loss or conversion that has occurred throughout the central grasslands region that's highlighted on the left of the screen, which has ultimately diminished the capacity of these systems to supply the functions that many of us rely on and have come to depend on, including individual farmers and ranchers and conservationists like myself. And so furthermore, we know that many of the species that depend on healthy and functioning grasslands for survival and persistence are vanishing right before our eyes. So many of you might remember the 3 billion birds paper that launched a few years ago, and just some staggering statistics from that paper. Grassland birds as a whole have lost roughly 50% of their original population sizes since the 1970s. And with some species experiencing losses up to 90% of their original population sizes. But there does appear to be a glimmer of hope. So the graph that I'm showing on the right-hand side of the screen depicts population trajectories for 3 groups of species: water birds on the top, forest birds in the middle, and grassland birds on the bottom. And we can see, in fact, that grassland birds do have a steeper declining trend than the other 2 species highlighted here. But what I want to draw your attention to is the dots that are plotted alongside of these trajectories, which show the dates of key Farm Bill legislation that supports conservation measures. So while this evidence is circumstantial, it does suggest that Farm Bill conservation programs do play a role in helping to stem the loss or stabilize population trajectories for grassland and forest birds, and may have contributed to the increase in populations that we're seeing for water birds. But I think more importantly, what this graph suggests is that in order for us to be most effective in our conservation strategies, we really need to engage with the folks that work and live alongside these grassland birds and in their habitats, engaging with the work that they're doing across our working landscapes.
So as Chris just described, grasslands present this unique and complex conservation challenge. And as he was just talking about at the end of that last slide, we know that we have to engage diverse stakeholders, whether they're state or federal partners, all the way down to producers, ranchers, private landowners. We are very, very much aware that we can't reverse the declines in grassland birds without finding durable solutions that can address both sides of the coin, both the social and biological objectives. And Bird Conservancy, as many of you may be aware, have invested significant time focused on grassland conservation and trying to understand these diverse drivers of declining grassland birds. And we do this through what we think of as an integrated approach that uses 3 primary programmatic areas. So we have a science program, an education program, and a stewardship program. And we like to think of those 3 programmatic areas as the legs of the 3 conservation stool. All of our work really tries to aim to take what we think of as a co-production approach. We do that both internally and with external partners, with the ultimate goal of finding actionable conservation delivery solutions. So just as an example, we might take and use our science data to inform on-the-ground stewardship action or education programming, and then we're always trying to iteratively update those either actions or programming based on new information as it comes in. Chris, next slide. Seems we have a little delay on the slide, so we apologize for that. So I guess I can start talking about the next slide. You guys are not seeing the integrated monitoring slide yet, correct, Chris?
Yeah, I'm working on it. It's not advancing.
Technological difficulties. No matter how many times you practice or how good we get at GoToMeeting or Zoom, there's always going to be these things, right? Well, I'll just start in on the next slide, and then hopefully we'll get that visual before I finish talking about it. Our largest and longest term program at Bird Conservancy is the Integrated Monitoring of Bird Conservation's Regions program. Here it is. Many of you guys may know it by the acronym IMBCR. So IMBCR is the second largest coordinated bird monitoring program in North America, and is a huge team effort in terms of implementing this program. It involves tons and tons of partners, including National Park Service, and it's really second only to the Breeding Bird Survey in terms of the geographic footprint. That footprint actually spans the better part of 16 states across Western North America, and the program's been running for over a decade. Unlike BBS, though, IMBCR uses a design-based approach, and it uses spatially balanced sampling with the goal of reducing bias to be able to estimate population sizes for birds in the Western US, and then also trend. We know how important it is to monitor the trends of some of these steeply declining species. It enables us to examine spatial and temporal variation in abundance for a large suite of species, approximately 80. But one of the unique things about IMBCR is that it enables us to provide these scalable estimates of abundance. And so we can provide estimates of abundance at very, very large geographies, for example, at the state level or at the bird conservation region level. But we can also scale those estimates down all the way down to units of interest for partners. So specific management units of interest. And because IMBCR has this really broad sampling, mostly off of roads, we can also use those baseline data to be able to make direct comparisons and assess and evaluate management practices, management and conservation practices of interest. And the program has really been growing in that direction. So a partner may come to us and say, we're interested in assessing the effects of a specific forest management practice. And we can use IMBCR data on that practice and compare it to reference data outside of that practice. What this paired approach enables us to do is to really be able to look at the effectiveness of the practice and then understand the return on investment for the work that we're doing on the landscape. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, so Brant just gave a nice overview of the IMBCR program and some of the data that we can glean from it. And I just wanted to next go over a few brief highlights of some of the ways that we're using those data to evaluate our conservation effectiveness. So the first one example that I'd like to start off with is the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. And so CRP is a voluntary conservation incentive program where private landowners can enroll their marginally productive agricultural land into this program and receive incentive payments to help restore those lands back to grasslands, either by planting native or introduced grasses and legumes. And so from a biodiversity perspective, the CRP program is really aimed at combating habitat loss and fragmentation due to agricultural production. And so using an impact reference design modified from the original IMBCR sampling protocol that Brant just described, we were able to evaluate the effectiveness of CRP practices for 35 species of grassland birds throughout the 5-state region highlighted in green on the right-hand side of your screens. And what we found was that parcels of land that had land enrolled into CRP practices supported large numbers of grassland birds, and particularly some of those more vulnerable obligate grassland bird species like grasshopper sparrows and lark buntings and conserve breeding habitat for upwards of 4.5 million birds per year. When we compare and contrast the population sizes between those treatment areas, so areas that had land enrolled into CRP plantings, compared to reference conditions, we see the largest increases for some of those highly vulnerable grassland obligate species that are particularly attracted to habitats with high heterogeneity in dense and tall grass structures, species like grasshopper sparrow and eastern meadowlarks. And for those species, we estimated that CRP plantings increase the population sizes of those vulnerable species for right around 1.8 million birds per year. However, we did find that decreases in population sizes relative to reference condition on those CRP planting areas for species that are more dependent on disturbance. Think species like the dickcissel and horned lark that favor habitats with more short grass and bare ground structures. And so what this suggests is that perhaps alternative or complementary approaches may be required for complementing the work that CRP is doing to bolster some of these populations of these more disturbance-dependent species. And so if we zoom out and think about the grassland bird community as a whole across this region spanning the northern, central, and southern Great Plains in the US, we see that as the amount of grassland habitat within the landscape decreases, so that blue curve on the left-hand side of your screen, as the amount of grassland habitat decreases as a function of habitat loss and fragmentation, we also see species richness decline. However, we did find that in some landscapes where CRP was present, if those CRP plantings amounted similar magnitudes of habitat loss, then those species richness losses can be at least partially, if not wholly, offset by increasing the amount of CRP cover in the landscape. So this is good news for conservation. And if we were to translate the figure on the left into map form, which is shown on the right, we can see the marginal effect of increasing CRP and its impact on species richness. And so those areas that pop out in bright red and orange color suggest areas where we might see the greatest return on our conservation investment into CRP from a species richness perspective. So those are the areas where we would expect increases in CRP would translate into increases in species richness, whereas those more blue and green color regions suggest areas where we might not expect to see little to no gains in species richness with increases in CRP cover. And so another conservation practice that Bird Conservancy and our partners are heavily invested in is understanding the impacts of prescribed grazing on bird populations and communities. And so from a biodiversity perspective, prescribed grazing is really targeted towards combating habitat degradation through improving stocking rates, targeting right around 25 to 40% grass utilization, and improving rest rotation schedules. And so using a similar impact reference design that I described for the CRP study, we evaluated the effectiveness of grazing management practices, which we defined as any parcel of land that was enrolled in a prescribed grazing plan regardless of practice type, and compared those to reference landscapes that had similar vegetation structure and composition, as well as climatic variability, but that had no land enrolled in grazing management plans. And so we could compare those treatment areas to those reference baseline conditions, as well as the broader region as a whole, to get a better picture of what's going on. And so when we look at the results for three key species of conservation concern, the Baird sparrow on the top, thick-billed longspur in the middle, and chestnut-collared longspur on the bottom, we do see a rather strong positive effect of grazing treatment on the density of these birds, suggesting that something about grazing management is benefiting these species, but we're currently working to try and figure out the underlying mechanisms of these species responses to better target management practices. All right, so the last two examples I highlighted are from our long-term monitoring data on the breeding grounds, but we know that a large majority of the species that breed in the grassland species that breed in the central grasslands region migrate and overwinter in the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands. And it's estimated that right around 90% of grassland species that migrate overwinter in the Chihuahuan Desert grasslands. And so when we look at the population trajectories of those species that overwinter in the Chihuahuan Desert versus all other grassland species, we do see a steeper rate of decline for the species that overwinter in the Chihuahuan Desert. So that suggests that this region is vitally important to the global populations and reversing those population declines for the species, and specifically aimed at targeted habitat management practices. This region faces similar threats that I outlined previously for the northern and central and southern Great Plains, including shrub encroachment and crop expansion, as well as desertification and climate change. And I should also mention that this region also has relatively little conservation capacity, especially in comparison to the neighboring states to the north in the US and Canada. So recognizing the importance of engaging with private landowners in our conservation efforts, in this region we work with a voluntary network of managed grazing lands, which we call the Sustainable Grazing Network. This network covers roughly 28 ranches that span 3 Mexican states and 4 grassland priority conservation areas. And the primary goal of this network is to improve the resilience and profitability of ranching operations, as well as to improve habitat conditions and bolster grassland bird populations throughout the region. And so earlier I highlighted that one of the biggest threats throughout the central grasslands region is woody plant encroachment. And so I just wanted to put that into an economic perspective to show sort of the economic impacts that this woody plant encroachment can have for producers. So the top graph that I'm showing here shows the cumulative change in tree cover since the 1990s, with the corresponding graph below that representing the cumulative loss revenue from tree cover expansion in millions of US dollars per year. And so when we aggregate this estimate across the US, this amounts to roughly $5 billion in foregone revenue for producers due to woody plant expansion. And it's estimated that we would see similar rates, if not greater, in Mexico. And so looking at the bird perspective now, we can look at the species responses to increasing shrub cover within the landscape. And so again, when we do that for 3 key species of conservation concern, with the Baird sparrow on top, chestnut collared longspur in the middle, and Sprague's pipit on the bottom, we see a rather strong negative effect of increasing shrub cover on population densities. However, we know that the scale at which management practices affect species likely depends on the biological response that we measure, and such that theories in fact suggest that the scale of effect would be larger for those biological responses that are influenced by forces that play out across longer time scales. So for instance, we might expect that management practices would need to be implemented over a larger spatial scale to influence abundance or occupancy, as opposed to survival or fecundity. And so some of the work that I'm just going to highlight some of the work that we've also been doing long-term in the Chihuahuan Desert region, where we've been evaluating the demographic responses through monitoring by tracking more than 1,600 individuals of grassland, grasshopper, and Baird sparrow since 2012 to estimate these demographic rates and provide more targeted management strategies. And so some of the, just to highlight some of the results that are coming out of that study. First, we see that in general, birds that had access to more shrubs within the spaces that they used tended to have higher survival than those that had lower access to shrubs within the spaces that they used at a much smaller spatial scale. So while this appears to contradict the result that I just shared with in terms of density, we again think that this could be a scale mismatch between the biological response and the scale at which birds are responding to habitat and management. Another result I'd like to highlight from that study is that when we looked at overwinter survival, which we defined as a 90-day period during the core winter months, we see that overwinter survival is really low, especially for what we would expect for a bird of this size. And it's highly variable across years. And so we're still working to parse out these results, but think that in part our such low estimates of survival are likely due to the fact that birds during their non-breeding period are highly mobile and across this dynamic region. And so being able to tease apart true survival from immigration out of the study area, as well as understanding seasonal habitat movements and associations, will help us to better target management actions at the appropriate places and times where we think that threats might be most limiting.
So Chris has just given you guys a broad overview of some of our programs at Bird Conservancy. And as you will hopefully have noticed, our goal is oftentimes trying to focus on responses of birds to management, and then when possible, using an adaptive approach to update those practices that we put on the ground for conservation delivery. It's apparent that to probably everyone in the room that the grassland birds span a huge geography, as he described before, the Great Plains all the way down to the Chihuahuan Desert. And so we're always trying to take a full annual cycle approach. We're always trying to use that full annual cycle lens in our work and implement that adaptive model across that geography. And Chris has given you some examples of some of the work that we've done, whether it's with CRP in the Great Plains or it's with the Sustainable Grazing Network down in Mexico. We also know that monitoring birds across the full annual cycle requires that we have vital information about when and where populations are limited. And our ability to study the movement and the connectivity of populations of migratory birds has evolved rapidly over the last decade. Specifically, our ability to use and apply miniaturized tracking devices on birds. And so Bird Conservancy has wanted to be at the leading edge or bleeding edge of use of technology, and we've embraced the use of those advances to try to understand how grassland birds are using the landscape with that ultimate goal of ensuring that our targeted management recommendations will continue to benefit birds and then the landscapes that those birds are existing on. Chris, next slide. I swear it only doesn't like me, Chris. It's changing fine for you. There it goes. So one example of that technology is MODIS. Most of you have probably heard of MODIS, but if you haven't, I'll just give you a brief primer. MODIS is a network of autonomous stations, and when paired with digitally encoded radio tags, it can be used to track how migratory birds are moving across the landscape. It was originally built out and established in the eastern part of the US and on the eastern seaboard. And slowly over the last decade, it has actually been steadily growing west, with the largest expansion taking place just in the last 2 to 3 years. And so when we think about MODIS at large spatial scales, it's informed a number of key informations and data gaps about the movement ecology of neotropical migrant birds. So some specific examples are MODIS has helped us estimate patterns of migratory connectivity for populations. It's informed our understanding of migration phenology, when and where birds are stopping over on the landscape. And in 2019, Bird Conservancy and a whole group of partners began the growth of the MODIS network across the Great Plains Chihuahuan Desert geography, with the goal of filling vital information gaps for grassland birds. To date, we've installed over 20 new MODIS stations across that geography within the red polygon you see on the map, and we've begun deploying lots and lots of these coded radio tags so that we can actually leverage the network on the landscape. That work has specifically been focused on what we affectionately term the Fab Four of grassland birds. Those are the 4 most steeply declining grassland bird species that include Baird sparrow, thick-billed longspur, Sprague's pipit, and chestnut-collared longspur. And over the next 2 to 5 years, we're going to be deploying approximately 100 towers on the landscape, and then hundreds and hundreds of tags on grassland birds to try to estimate patterns of migratory connectivity, look at where birds are utilizing the landscape, what those migratory pathways and trajectories look like, to try to help inform spatial prioritization of key habitats on the landscape. Next slide. But in addition to leveraging MODIS and MODIS technology at these really large spatial scales, MODIS can also be used at much smaller spatial scales, from the region down to even the management unit of interest. And so it's a subtly different deployment of the MODIS towers, but they can be put out there in a dense array of what we call or term nodes. And those nodes can actually inform how grassland birds utilize the landscape at these very, very fine spatial scales. So in the lower right-hand corner of the slide here, what you'll see are some kernel density estimates derived from high spatial and temporal resolution MODIS tracking data. And these type of data mean that we can actually use MODIS to help us understand how grassland birds respond to specific management actions of interest, whether it's grazing or shrub removal or really any action that we might be putting on the landscape. And because MODIS nodes can be paired at small spatial scales with towers that might occur across a larger geographic region, we can actually use this technology to help differentiate emigration from mortality and provide these estimates of true survival, which is a real data gap for grassland birds, in particular because they are so highly mobile and dynamic in terms of the way they use the landscape. Next slide, Chris. And so I just wanted to kind of bring it all back together with this last slide to discuss how Bird Conservancy has approached grassland conservation at the biome scale. So several years ago, our fearless leader, Executive Director Tammy Vercauteren, and some key partners spearheaded the development and implementation of the Grassland Roadmap Summit. And the goal of the summit was to facilitate a collaborative conservation model for North America's central grasslands. In essence, the Grassland Roadmap is a trinational effort and that engages all of the sectors that are involved in grassland conservation. So that includes indigenous groups, state and federal partners, the private sector and industry, ranchers, farmers, producers, academics, nonprofit organizations, and then diverse funders. And the goal of the summit is to use a collaborative approach to reach 3 primary objectives. As I just described, there's this diverse group of stakeholders that are involved and invested in the outcomes of grassland conservation. So we wanted to strengthen the collaborations among that diverse set of partners to really be able to have a coordinated effort in terms of the way conservation delivery is put on the ground. The second goal or objective of the summit was to try to refine and, when possible, develop new policy initiatives to promote biome scale grassland conservation. And then last but not least was to take the available science that we had bring partners together, and leverage that science to really inform maximum conservation. And so this all takes place with the ultimate idea of being able to provide benefits to the economic livelihood of the people who are on those working lands, to provide solutions that will support the resiliency of these landscapes in the face of climate change, and then ultimately try to mitigate the threats that face some of these grassland species that are so steeply declining. And what I would say when we look at the grassland roadmap and the work that we do at Bird Conservancy at smaller spatial scale, our approach is largely a microcosm of that one that we've tried to implement for the summit. We're always aiming to use this model of co-production to develop actionable science. We want to provide these durable conservation delivery solutions that really balance human livelihood as well as wildlife livelihood. And I think, and I hope, what we've presented to you today throughout the talk is that we're always aiming to leverage our science data to monitor the effectiveness of the practices, to ensure that that we're getting good conservation return on our investment, that we're actually seeing responses for some of the species that we're interested in. And then the last and probably most important part of our work is always this regular communication and iterative outreach that we do associated with our products, whether they're science or stewardship products, because we have to have the engagement of the stakeholders in order to ensure that these are durable, lasting conservation solutions. Chris, next slide. And you know, we obviously do this with a huge amount of partners and support from a diverse group of funders. And so with that, I think we will wrap up and turn our cameras back on and give you guys an opportunity to just ask us some questions about the work that we do.
Great, thank you both very much. That was highly informative. Once again, I remind people, if you have questions, you can either raise your hand or you can put a question into the question box. One of the things that we, the MPS, have been doing and helping out this greater effort that Bird Conservancy is doing is trying to identify those key NPS units within the central grasslands that can help fill in the MODIS gaps. You know, we do not have a huge footprint in the central grasslands, and many of our units are quite small. And so this is one way that we decided that we can help with a relatively small investment, a much larger conservation effort and conservation project that goes way beyond the park boundaries. And our first test park, I believe, is going to be Fort Union in New Mexico. But we have 8 or so parks identified, and the hard part is trying to convince the park administration that this project, even though it does not directly benefit the management of species within the park boundary, its overall benefit to the conservation of birds is a benefit to the park. And that's always the most difficult thing. I don't see any other questions coming in. What is the relative cost to install a MODIS unit? Like if a park is interested in either doing a study like you were, trying to figure out the impacts of management actions, or to join a greater conservation effort?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll just address the point that you were making about the national park system, and one of the most important things about MODIS is that it only works well if you have lots and lots of stations. And so as that network grows, you see these emergent properties and emergent benefits of having more and more stations on the landscape. Our ability to, you know, detect birds as they move through the landscape increases exponentially the more towers we have on the landscape. In terms of the cost of the station installation, some of this obviously is going to depend on what geography you're in and how far people have to travel and so on and so forth. But the average cost of the equipment without any personnel investment is about $7,000. And then once you bring personnel in terms of installing those stations, you're talking in the 10 to 12 range for the actual installation of the station. In terms of the array-based, node-based approach that I was describing, those nodes themselves are actually significantly less money, on the $300 to $400 range per node. The big cost is deploying a sufficient number of tags, and obviously to have the power to analyze how the birds are utilizing the landscape. So yeah, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Chris.
No, that sounds about right. Yeah, a lot of our cost is wrapped up in personnel and travel, and so we are starting to host more of these Modus workshops aimed at sort of increasing the capacity of different folks and organizations to help install this broader network throughout that region. As you saw, that there was an obvious gap throughout that central region compared to the eastern United States.
And I just would add to that Modus is a true community of science where the community is the researchers. And if, like, we'll just pick the Fort Union, when they get their receiving station set up, it does not matter if it's Bird Conservancy or what is it, the TG Ranch up in Montana or some other researcher in Canada that is tagging the birds. Any bird that is tagged with the Modus tag that comes within range will trigger that, and it'll benefit that research. We do have a couple of questions.
I would just chime in and add to that. Modus isn't specific to birds. You can even use it to track pollinators and mammals, small and large mammals. So there's value in that as well.
Yeah, Idaho's is looking at doing a Modus installation for monarch butterflies.
The other thing I'll just add quickly before you ask questions, so we're also extending that network down into the Chihuahuan Desert in Mexico. And so right now we've got some funding to install about 10 stations down in Mexico, and we're continuing to try to get additional resources to expand the network south of the border, because obviously that's where a lot of these species are wintering.
Very cool. Okay, back to the question. Sorry to take up all the time. So this question is, some would say that the waterbirds population success story is a prime example of successful adaptive management, also heavily related to waterfowl hunting. Where/how does adaptive management fit into your grassland bird conservation efforts, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I can start on that, and I'll have Chris add in. Before I address the specific question, one of the reasons, waterfowl conservation has been successful for a whole suite of reasons, including hunting, duck stamps, NAWCA. But there is motivation to get a Grassland Conservation Act similar to NAWCA in place that would provide funding that would support some of the implementation of some of the grassland work that we're talking about at the summit and then at the finer scale work. In terms of adaptive management, one of the things that's unique about Bird Conservancy is that we have pretty broad scale monitoring data, and then we also have a network of private lands wildlife biologists that are housed in Natural Resource Conservation Service offices. Those biologists are actually tasked with providing technical assistance to landowners on the ground and leverage farm bill dollars to implement practices on the ground. And so we've been working really hard with NRCS to develop monitoring programs that would enable us to assess the effectiveness of those practices to make sure that we're getting that good return on investment, and then provide that feedback piece to how the practice gets implemented and how we work with the rancher on the landscape. And so, and we can leverage our science data and then the stewardship biologists proper to try to create that that interface.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is multiple questions within one, and I can help answer some of these because we have motor stations and parks that have been up for quite a few years. And I'll unmute you, Daniel, after I ask this. I'm curious about the durability of the motor stations, maintenance costs, technological stability, unit's ability to continue to talk to other devices, etc.
Well, I mean, one of the things I will say, so maintenance cost is something that we don't have a great handle on at this point in time. One of the things we are doing to address the durability question is, or well, I should say the applicability question is using receivers that can detect multiple types of tags. So there are two types of code sets out there that are pretty common on the in the marketplace. Those include cellular technology tags, and then the other one is a code set that was developed by low-tech wireless. And so we're putting receivers out there that can detect either of those types of tags. And we don't anticipate in the short term all of a sudden the technology turning over and being, you know, different from what it is now. So the network in the East Coast has been operating for quite some time. And so I think that there will be decent longevity in terms of once the stations are installed.
Yes, I would agree. Some of the other, like the Timbuktuan has had a station up for 4 years, I believe, maybe 3 years. And I just spoke to them this spring, and they have not had any associated maintenance cost with operating that station. The station was installed by Fish and Wildlife Service. And the other big question that folks have as far as park units installing this is the time aspect of it. And they have very minimal time with that station because it is connected to the internet. He figures maybe 2 hours every 2 months is his time commitment for that station. If it's not connected to the internet or through cellular, you might have to download that data periodically, which is relatively simple as well, but it's not that much time. And then I was noticing the Miyagi, the antennas can be quite large, and so they have to be on a very stable platform because the winds can mess with it. It's kind of like they're not as large as like some of the ham radio antennas I've seen, but they're bigger than your old TV antennas from back in the 70s. That is it for the questions that I've seen that have come in. The other's a statement from Padre Island saying that they had a researcher that is going to install a MODA station at Padre Island, which is really cool because of the flyway that's right there. But no other questions have come in. Brant, Chris, both, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to present to us. I think the Grasslands roadmap and the work you guys are doing is phenomenal. And I just see the Grasslands roadmap as gaining steam with more and more partners kind of adding in. It's a unique approach, I think, to conservation as far as the human aspects of it. And everybody else, thank you very much for taking your time out of the busy day to join and watch this presentation. Reminder, next month, we'll be talking about the protocols for the Southern Colorado Plateau Network. And that's just a statement, not a question. But thank you very much. Everyone have a great rest of your week. Stay healthy and stay sane. Bye.
Thanks.